following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, and I'm the guy that pushes on the door of life marked pull. And what I do is I talk to the most interesting folks in the world, and I identify what's going on in the world a little bit, how what I call the unholy trinity is holding us back as a society, and that is government, big business, and organized religion. But I also talk a lot of baseball, a lot of sports, talk to interesting people. Today is no exception, and it's not a coincidence that it's 30 years since my guest made his mark on the world. Jon Leonoudakis, 30 years to the day. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Ralph, and at 5:04 p.m., 30 years ago today, I was in line waiting to buy a hot dog at Candlestick Park. About 25 minutes or so after that, Game 3 of the World Series between the A's and the Giants was supposed to start, but it didn't turn out that way.
No, it didn't. And you just so happened to have your video camera, and a high-quality video camera at that, with you on that date. Tell us about what led up to you bringing it, and in my tribe, you'd say, "Zug me a Geschichte." Tell me a story.
Well, I've been a lifelong Giants fan. I grew up in the city in the 60s. The Giants were my team. Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Juan Marichal. They were just the greatest team, and I just loved rooting for them and following them on the radio, the newspaper every day, KTVU broadcasts whenever we would get them. Later on in life, from 70 to 75, I worked at Candlestick Park in the parking lots. So I had an intimate relationship with the team and the stadium and the terrible weather, all of that went with it. And I bled orange and black from a young child, and still follow and love the Giants to this day. But that was the impetus, and I was too young to remember. I was only 4 when they went to the '62 World Series and lost that bitter loss in 7 games to the Yankees. So '89 was my first opportunity.
McCovey and Bobby Richardson came together on one fateful play.
Yeah. But '89 was, the chance for the Giants to go back to the World Series. It was coming to Candlestick Park. My brother was a season ticket holder, and so he knew how much I loved the team, and I was living in Los Angeles by that time, and he invited me to come up. And I'm a filmmaker, and one of the things we were trained as filmmakers in school was that anytime you're going to an event, bring your camera, bring a recording device, because something may happen. Or you're going to record something remarkable anyway, but if something out of the ordinary happens, you're prepared. So I not only brought loads of 35 millimeter film for my camera, my still camera. My dad had a huge Magnavox VHS camcorder, which sold for about $850 in the mid-1980s. So it was not cheap back then, and it did render, as you say, pretty decent video quality. So we went out there, we parked around 4:15, and I just started interviewing fans in the lot, and I just wanted to capture the pageantry of the World Series in my town with my team playing our hated rivals, the Oakland A's. It was really something. And then, of course, at 5:04 p.m., everything took a left turn.
Wow. Where would have you been if it weren't for that game?
Well, I would have been back in Los Angeles. I'd have been watching from, my living room. I watched the World Series every year. So no, I would not have even been in the city. And my wife drove up with me. We'd gotten married earlier that summer. And as it turned out, she wasn't at the game with me. She was visiting friends in Sacramento. But part of the tension of the earthquake experience for me personally was I didn't know where she was. This was, of course, before the internet and, cell phones.
Before cell phones, you couldn't just instantaneously make sure everybody's okay.
Well, so you had none of that. And later on, I come to find that she had driven over the Bay Bridge about 10 minutes before that collapse. So it was a very difficult and a very scary time.
Absolutely. I was living in Oakland on 59th and Telegraph, and sitting out on the back porch, just hanging, waiting for it to come on the radio, my favorite way of getting baseball. And all of a sudden, the place starts shaking, and I made eye contact with a neighbor from across the way, and we looked at each other and went, whoa, like we both knew this was heavy, and heavy it was for a lot of folks.
My brother told me, because he was at our seats, and we were between third base and the outfielder and left field along the line there. Row N, up from the field, so we had good seats, but he was telling me when that earthquake, the seismic wave, came through the ballpark, they watched it roll all the way through, almost from the dugout all the way out to the warning track. And when it hit the warning track, all this dust went up in the air. And there were parts of the stadium, not much, but some parts where pieces of the stadium up in the canopy in the right center field area, there were some pieces crumbled off. There was an apocryphal story that a guy who left his seat to go get a beer, and when he came back, his seat was smashed to pieces by a big chunk of concrete.
Whoa.
But, there would have been a much greater disaster, Ralph, if a civil engineer 2 or 3 years before made a point saying, hey, we need to inspect Candlestick and make sure it's up to date for earthquake code. And they discovered that they needed to install 4 expansion joints into the canopy. Now, the canopy is the big bowl where the upper deck is all rests in. And if that doesn't happen, I think there was a much greater possibility for a lot of death and injuries that day. So that civil engineer we owe a debt of gratitude to.
Absolutely, because the word retrofitting hadn't become popular in our vernacular until after the earthquake. As generally happens, close the barn door after the horse is gone. So whoever that man is, I'd like to give his name some credit on this podcast.
I wish I knew it offhand.
Yeah.
But he worked for the city of San Francisco. He was a civil engineer.
Right, so he wasn't apt to get the publicity, but let's Google it and see if we can't find out who that was, because that's very interesting. I happen to have heard a radio clip today about Dave Dravecki sitting in the locker room, and it starts to happen. And he's chatting with someone, and I can't remember who it was, and they both ran out into the parking lot and went, oh my God, what's around us? Basically, like you with the wife, not knowing where friends, relatives are, family, kids. Whoa. Scary.
It is. And, there are people who will be listening to this podcast who likely weren't born yet at that time, and they'll probably think, well, these people were back in the Stone Age. What do you mean? You didn't have Twitter? You didn't have Facebook? You couldn't call someone on a cell phone? And there were some cell phones, but really only high-end business people had them. They were the size of...
They were called car phones. You'd have a phone
the
in
car
your car.
phones. But those weren't working anyway. Those cell towers got wiped out the minute that quake struck, so they were useless. And don't
like
forget,
my dear old self.
Yeah, well, don't forget that, Candlestick is in Bayview Hunters Point, which at the time was one of the highest crime rates in San Francisco, if not the Bay Area. And that was not a place you wanted to get stuck after dark. God help you, if your car battery died and you came out after a Giants night game, it could get hairy around there. And not to mention, cold and all that stuff. So once the
wind would come in at night and just absolutely pulverize people.
It was like Moscow, in San Francisco. It was crazy, but
Moscow light. It was more like mint.
So the sun is setting. There's a mass exodus. Everybody knows that the first responders are busy, and so anything could happen. And the traffic jam getting out of there was crazy because the power was knocked out, so none of the street signals were working, and you had chaos. And I think people kept their heads together. Because in San Franciscans, Oakland, people in the Bay Area, we know how to deal with earthquakes. We don't panic. And so there was no panic in the stadium when everybody was asked to leave. Now, not everybody also knew the extent of the damage. We were all getting our information old school, transistor radios, and passing the information along person to person. Of course, out in the parking lot, some people had battery-powered televisions. And that's when we saw how bad this was, the fire in the marina, the collapse on the bridge, and, of course, the horrible, horrible collapse of 880. That's when it really hit home, and that's when I think everybody understood this is a major tragedy. And, no one really knew how the scope of the problem and the tragedy at that point. Everybody just knew they wanted to get the heck out of there and get home.
You mentioned that there are people who are born today who were born after that happened that do think of us, old folks, as having lived in the Stone Ages without these computers and devices and cell phones, and this or the other. My son's mother was pregnant with my son, and I was waiting for her to come home that day. 30 years ago. He was born the following April. And and he's never been without a cell phone. He's never been in the dark ages as I think of them.
Ralph, I think if we had had the internet and social media at the time of the earthquake back then, I think there would have been a much greater possibility for people panicking and stampeding each other. I think that's a really interesting discussion for somebody to have about how the evolution of technology may not have necessarily helped in that particular situation. I think in that situation, being a little bit ignorant was helpful in terms of maintaining, people keeping their heads together and leaving the stadium in an orderly fashion.
John, that is an incredibly wonderful topic that can transcend sports, the social media and what have you, what we get from the internet in terms of instantaneous knowledge, what that trade-off is in society.
Yeah.
How we lose socialization face-to-face. We could go weeks without having a conversation with anybody who isn't on Facebook, if you think about it. And that could be good. But by the same token, there's good and bad in everything. And that's an interesting sociological study in the making.
I think
trade-off of what we're getting. Is it worth it?
I think that back then, I mean, as soon as all of that happened, right, when you went out into the parking lot, you were instantly connected with absolutely every person that was there because it was a shared experience. Didn't matter if you're a Giants fan, didn't matter if you're an A's fan, didn't matter if you're an umpire, what have you. We were all in the same boat. I also have to say that when I first got out into the parking lot, we were headed back to our car, people were tailgating and partying because they hadn't really understood the scope of the tragedy at that point. If they had, that wouldn't have been going on. But that was kind of a remarkable social piece that I was like, are you kidding me? There was a big earthquake. The earthquake just got the game just got canceled, and you guys are out here partying. It was. Well,
they're partying because they weren't under the bridge. Well,
I don't think anybody. Like I said, I don't think they realize that. Plus, I think people also. They manage fear and concerns in their own way. And let's face it, everybody was out at that game to have a good time. And now that the game was canceled, by God, I'm out there at the ballpark. I'm going to have fun before I got to get out of here. I could understand that perspective. But it was just remarkable. But as I said, I think once people understood the gravity of the situation, that whole partying thing ended, and people said, we better get out of here.
And I'm sure the people that were partying weren't the majority. I think you may have hit upon some folks.
We had pockets. There were pockets of that going on. But I think once the reality of the situation hit people, and of course it was getting dark. You know, and there were no like lights in the parking lot. You know, you were truly going to be in the dark if you didn't get your butt out of there. So that didn't last long, but that was the initial sort of thing I ran into when we were out there. And if you see my film, by the way, people in the Bay Area, you're all invited as a free screening of my film from that particular day. This Saturday at San Francisco Public Library, 100 Larkin Street in Civic Center. It's free in the state-of-the-art Claret Auditorium. I'm bringing with me a traveling exhibit of artifacts, relics, and memorabilia that I had back then and I've collected since then. That'll be part of that event. We're going to do Q&A, and we're going to have a great crowd there, and all of your listeners are welcome.
Beautiful. I, for one, will promise to be there. I'm excited by that. I'm excited.
And if anybody can't make it, they can watch the film.
I saw you in the old days in the parking lot. You were the guy that transferred all the money collected to the right people.
Yeah, we had to have those white smocks on, and God help you if you didn't turn over everything to the penny. Boy, they'd get after you.
Oh, would they ever? And they were so hard. It was so difficult to be caught in those days, too. I have other friends who have done that. In those days, the parking lots in San Francisco turned over a lot of bucks. I don't know how it is now with the electronic way of doing things.
Well, the parking piece has really been impacted in San Francisco with your Uber and your Lyft people. I think the parking people have really taken a hit in that regard.
They work so hard over the years, too. I'm so sorry for them.
But I was going to mention, Ralph, if anybody can't
make it... The owners, not the people who are out there.
Sure. Yeah,
you own a parking lot anywhere in a big city, that's a gold mine. Yeah.
I was going to say, if your listeners can't make it on Saturday, they can stream the film online on Vimeo on Demand, and you just want to go Vimeo on Demand, the sweet spot, and that's my streaming channel. $1.50, all you can eat. We got about 8 hours of binge-worthy content there. Some of my past films about Arnold Haino, the Baseball Reliquary, of course, my series, The Sweet Spot. But all they got to do is scroll all the way down on the menu to bonus features, and they'll find it there the day the World Series stopped.
Well, and John, that reminds me how you brought Jon Haino to this microphone. Not Jon Haino.
Arnold Haino.
Arnold Haino to these microphones. His book was a big part of my youth. he wrote a book about, it was called The Day in the Bleachers, about the 1954 World Series and the day Willie made the catch.
Game 1.
Pardon me?
It was Game 1 of the 54 series.
Oh, okay.
The opening game. But yeah, I many people point to that book as one of the most iconic books in baseball, written from the fan perspective. One of the first.
I loved it. It was right up there with the Brosnan books when I was a kid, and a few others that come to mind, like Joe Garagiola and Bill Veck is in Wreck by Lynn.
Oh, yeah.
That set the tone for my baseball fandom. I always wanted to know what was going on the inside of stuff.
Yeah.
And we share a curiosity, and I'm so happy to have you as a continued guest. John, before I let you go, I want to ask you, and in the wake, it is the anniversary. What is this, the 15th or the 16th of the month?
17th.
And the Trump thing is coming down. How do you see the end game going? I've been asking all of my guests and fellow podcasters how they see it turning out. And I'm wondering how you see it turning out.
Well, I have a lot of concerns. I think at best he's either, he's no longer in office not long from now, and can no longer, cause the negative harm to the world that he has and the division that he has caused in our country. We need people that are going to unite the people of this country. There are differences across the board, but at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and we all want to do the right thing. We all have the same concerns: healthcare, education, equality for women, all of those things. Those are not Democrat or Republican issues. Those are people issues. And I think that, the discourse, we've gotten away from an intelligent society that can talk through their differences and has descended into something that is divisive and rancorous and completely at cross purposes for a people that, in the past have been able to work together to solve some of the world's difficult problems. And I think that hopefully we're looking at an end game not too far from now, and at the very worst, that we will have a new president come next November, and we'll try and set things right, because these are very dark days.
And let's hope that new president is to the left of what we're used to, because what you recognize as basic human needs, a lot of people classify as socialism. And I don't think socialism is a bad word. The only person that can do what you're talking about, as I see it, is Bernie. And I'm hoping he's the guy. That's just how I feel about it. I'm tired of voting for the lesser of two evils. Trump notwithstanding. Everybody's the lesser of evils to Trump, but I want to go further than replacing Trump with just another schmagegi who's going to be tied to the corporations and the big drug companies and the medical companies and this, that, and the other, the insurance companies. That's got to stop. So let's hope for the best. And John, I'm so appreciative of you being a guest. Thank you, sir.
It is my pleasure, Ralph. I really appreciate you inviting me on, and it's a pleasure to connect with you and your audience. And let's hope that the Giants and the A's take it another step further next year. I'm always rooting for the A's to break through that first round I think it's a heck of a team. You know, I think the A's are one of the more progressive baseball teams in Major League Baseball. I really like the direction they're headed in, the people who run the place. I just hope they get their stadium settled soon.
I was going to say, we may be talking about the Las Vegas A's.
I cannot abide. I'm an old school guy, and I don't think any pro sports should have anything to do with Las Vegas. You know, it used to be gambling was the big bugaboo in Major League Baseball, and for some reason, well, the reason is money. That's all going away, and you know, Major League Baseball is in bed with, you know, so-called legalized gambling. You see gambling casinos featured at just about every Major League park. They've got representation and advertising there. Heck, even in Comerica Park in Detroit, Ralph, you can buy lottery tickets on the concourse. What is that teaching kids? I've got a real problem with that, so I certainly hope the A's don't move there, and I hope no other teams move there. But, of course, the Oakland Traders are moving there, and they've already got a hockey team there. But that sort of thing really chafes me. I don't like to see professional sports mingling with gambling stuff like that. I just don't.
Well, what gets me is the prospect of kids who grew up following, kids of any age who grew up following a franchise, loving the players, loving the colors, loving the experience. All of a sudden it's pulled from them, as it was pulled from me when I was 10 years old and the New York Giants moved to San Francisco. And so I'm still an apologist of the San Francisco Giants, and had a great show that's going to be published later this week with Michael Duca identifying what's been happening with the Giants and their season and their prospects. Look for that. Look for John at the at the San Francisco Library. You'll send me a link to that, and I'll publish it, and I'll also publish this show this evening. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Ralph.
Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back at you real soon. Adios.
Okay.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.